said that you're going to be able to give us an introduction on what's happening in the US, the background to Trump's election for about 15 minutes. Is that okay?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Are you ready?
Yes. Will you let me know when I'm at 10 minutes?
I will do. All right, I'll wave into the camera.
Great. Should I just go ahead?
Go for it. You're ready to go.
Awesome. Hi everyone. I'm seeing an empty screen, but I'm assuming people are there. So, so a few weeks ago, 60 million Americans voted for an openly racist, misogynist candidate for their president, and he was elected, and he's now the president-elect, and he's Donald Trump. And there's been a lot of different reasons for why this happened, and that's what I'm going to go through today in my talk. So I'm going to get right into it. Why did Trump win? What are the factors? So the first and most important one is the Democratic Party, and how the Democratic Party helped Trump win and helped Trump gain popularity. So Hillary Clinton, who was running under the Democrats, represented the, is everything okay? Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Great, okay. Represented the establishment, right? Represented the status quo, the politics of the Democrats. The Democrats have been in power 16 of the last 24 years. Hillary Clinton's husband, Bill Clinton, was in office for 8 years. She represents NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which has really hurt the American working class. She represents the Great Recession, when many banks were bailed out, and this was under President Obama. She represents the decline in healthcare, growing austerity, the increase of the number of people who are living below the poverty line. That's almost doubled since the 90s. And all of this has happened largely under the Democratic Party, under Obama, and Hillary was Secretary of Clinton under Obama. So, you know, under her as well. And this increasingly intolerable status quo is what made a lot of Americans look away from the Democratic Party, that they were disillusioned with the Democratic Party, and they were looking for another way. They were looking for someone else. And this is where Trump comes in. So, you know, a lot of people are saying that the people who voted for Trump are all racists, they're all white supremacists. People are calling this the white lash, that it was a white lash that led to the election of Trump. And while this is true, you know, every Klan supporter, every Ku Klux Klan supporter, every white nationalist, white supremacist definitely voted for Trump and was empowered by Trump. But at the same time, there are a lot of working class people who saw in Trump a shift away from the status quo, a shift away from the establishment. They saw him as, you know, a businessman. He's a businessman. He did not hold any public office before running for president. And so they saw him as a way out. They saw him as a way to rebel against the Democratic Party and against the establishment as it stands. And Trump was very strategic, and he utilized that. His rhetoric appealing to the working class, his rhetoric about making America great again, that America has strayed far from its roots, that he wants to focus on the working class people, he wants to get jobs back into the country, and obviously blaming immigrants, mostly Muslim and Mexican immigrants for the loss of jobs. And he used all of that to build his platform. And it's also important to remember that a lot of the rhetoric he used was not new. It was something that the Republican Party and the Democratic Party had both used in the past. The anti-immigrant, Islamophobia, homophobia, and even sexist rhetoric. What was different about Trump is he was a lot more severe in all of this, and he capitalized on his anti-establishment position since he was a businessman, and painted himself as someone who came from the bottom and was able to rise to the top on his own, even though his father was a billionaire. And the reason that he was able to continue that empire was because he took money from his father. So it's important to remember that while all, you know, Ku Klux Klan members or supporters are Trump supporters, that not all Trump supporters are necessarily white nationalists or racists. And there's actually a really good quote that I want to read so the day after the elections, okay, I can't find it. The day after the elections, a member of the International Social Organization was, out interviewing people, and one white working class woman said, I would never vote for Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton reminds me of my boss, John. And John is always lying to me. And that's what I see in Hillary Clinton. And then she continued and said that she didn't agree with Trump. And she said, I'm not marrying the man, but he's not the Democrats. And he was able to make it to the top on his own. So this is really important to remember when we're thinking of what attracted people to Trump. And that a lot of them were working class people who saw in him a shift away from the Democratic Party and from the status quo. So that's the first thing. The second point is voter suppression. So unlike previous elections, there was lower voter turnout this election. 10 million people didn't vote. 10 million fewer people from 2012 did not vote. And most of these people were actually minorities. And so it's clear that they were left with, they were unhappy with the two choices they were given. They had to either choose a sexist, anti-immigrant businessman, or Hillary Clinton, who stands for, who's an imperialist, who is best friends with Wall Street, and who is involved in so many different scandals, with the leaked emails, the fact that the Democratic National Convention, the DNC, tried to take media and airtime away from Bernie Sanders, who was who's also running for president as an open socialist, and who received something like 12 million votes. He was clearly someone that a lot of people saw as anti-establishment. Many people who supported Bernie Sanders ended up voting for Trump. So it's very clear that people were not happy with these two choices. And for that reason, there are 10 million people who just did not vote, who voted last time for Obama. Another reason a lot of people didn't vote was because 868 voting booths were closed across the United States this time around. So that was, 868 fewer voting booths. There were a lot more ID restrictions in order to vote. And that made it so that if anyone didn't have the proper ID, they weren't allowed to vote, or if people at the booths were not aware of what the proper ID was supposed to be, they would just turn people away. There were also there's a lot of intimidation at the voting booths. A lot of Trump supporters would come to the voting booths and basically scare people away. And there was one example of this in Texas where someone showed up with a sign with racist slurs and a gun. So that's one example. And there were also in different places there was a shortage of ballots. There just weren't enough ballots, and they had to go scramble to get more, which led to a lot of people just leaving and not voting. One really good example of this is the state of Michigan. In Michigan, Trump won by only 10,000 votes, and in that particular state, there was a shortage of ballots. Almost 5,000 people were turned away because they didn't have proper IDs, or they were told that they didn't. There's a lot of intimidation on the lines when they were waiting. There were also very, very long lines, and people were waiting for 6-7 hours to vote. So that's another reason. The third is the Electoral College. So the Electoral College was introduced, I'll explain what that is, was written into the Constitution to protect slavery. And what it did was instead of giving one person one vote and just having the president be decided by the popular vote, what this did is it assigned every state a number of electoral votes, and these votes were chosen based on a small group of people that are voted in, and they choose which candidate to support, and then the electoral votes are counted up, and whoever gets, I believe it's 168, wins, and that's how Trump won. He got more electoral votes. And why is this important? It's important because the reason this was first put into place was to protect slavery in the South. The southern states had more electoral votes. They were given more electoral votes. They were given this because they had the population in the South was smaller than that in the North, and they were worried that that they would not be able to continue to be slave states if they were voted out, basically. And so the Electoral College gives outsized influence to less populated rural states, which are more often than not Republican states.
So you've got 5 minutes left. I mean, if it's, I know, kind of running out of time a little bit. If it's possible to say about the protest, it'd be.
Yes. Okay, I'm getting there. Okay, so let me just get that done. So, what has this meant? After Trump was elected, you know, we saw a rise in hate crimes in the first 3 days. There were over 200 hate crimes against vulnerable people, including Muslims, people of color, Black people, and immigrants. And this is more than the post 9/11 era, which is really horrific to think about. You know, at the same time, this is obviously going to impact organizing on the ground, whether it's about Palestine and the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, or Black Lives Matter. And at the same time, though, we've seen a huge pushback from people on the ground. Within 24 hours, on November 9th, within 24 hours after the election results were put out, there were protests in over 40 cities across the country. Hundreds of thousands of people were out protesting. This was, you know, the largest protest against any U.S. elected president in a very long time. And what was crazy about these particular protests is that they brought together all sorts of people. So there were people out there who were pro-Hillary protesting, there were anarchists, there were socialists, there were a lot of people who had never been to a protest before. And these protesters flooded the streets. In New York in particular, I was involved in some of these protests the day after the election results, and they shut down over 10 blocks where you just couldn't move because of how many people were there. Hundreds of cars were just left abandoned in the streets as drivers just came out, parked their car right there in the middle of the street, came out and joined the protests. And the police, obviously in response, put up barricades in front of Trump Towers in New York City, but also in other places where he has towers, Miami, Los Angeles, and just blocked entire sidewalks to make sure protesters don't get in. And the protests have continued daily until today. Ever since November 9th. Every single day there's a protest. In New York City, even today, there's a protest outside of Trump Towers, and this has not stopped. This has been consistent. And another very, very important movement is the campus movements and what students are doing. And one of the biggest movements is called the Sanctuary Campus Movement. And what that is it's student activists came together to demand that campuses become sanctuary places for undocumented students. Trump pledged that he would detain 3 million immigrants in his first few days in office. And so in response to that, this campus movement was born. And on the first day, just 2 weeks ago, over 100 campuses participated in a large walkout where students left class and congregated on campus, and then either marched through downtown, wherever they were, whatever city they were in, or congregated in the middle of campus and had a speak out, demanding that their schools become sanctuary campuses, demanding that their schools refuse to give information over to the immigrant authorities and refuse to let them on campus, and continue to give undocumented students financial aid and adequate housing. And in response, a lot of administrations have actually responded to this and have declared their campuses a safe campus. One example of this is Columbia University in the city of New York. It's responded and it's declared its campus a safe campus. You know, and all of this shows that there's a really big political opening for organizing, for protesting, for organizing the left. It's also shown that people are no longer willing to rely on the Democratic Party, that the two-party system is corrupt, and that they're looking for this third opening. They're looking for a way to build a third party, something that can challenge the existing status quo. And the Democrats, you know, Obama has been very conciliatory to Trump. He has said that we are going to work with him, we should unite together and help him succeed. Bernie Sanders has done the same. Hillary Clinton too, she's been very quiet. In fact, the only people that have really put up any sort of opposition to Trump, aside from people on the street, on the ground, is Jill Stein of the Green Party. And she's raised $5 million in the course of about 3 days and demanded a recount of the votes in Wisconsin, which is one of the states that had a very close tie between Hillary and Trump. and has demanded a recount, so that's going to happen there. But aside from that, the Democratic Party has really done nothing to stop Trump, and has done nothing to criticize Trump and all the racist, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, and anti-immigrant people he's recently hired into his team. And like I said, the protests are continuing. The biggest protest will be in Washington, D.C. the day of inauguration on January 20th. Over a fourth million people have already RSVP'd to go to D.C. and protest the inauguration, and that's what a lot of campus groups are right now organizing towards. And yeah, I'll leave it. I guess I'll just end by saying that, you know, he is likely going to become president. I don't think we're going to be able to change that, but at the same time, we shouldn't assume that this means the U.S. is moving towards like a fascist regime. That a lot of people who voted for him are not white nationalists. But at the same time, that we don't know how this could change in the future, and we need to be able to build and organize to consistently to oppose Trump and those empowered by him.
Cool. Thank you very much, Sumaya. And one of the very few video links I've ever been part of this, actually. Our second speaker is back to talk a bit more broadly about the kind of situation with what's been called the alt-right across America, but also across Europe, and some of the kind of the broader political trends we've seen emerge. Go on back.
How long have I got?
About 10.
Okay. I wanted to give a bit more of a sort of a big picture view of what I think are the kind of underlying political trends behind what we've seen with Trump's election, and a bit of how they resonate more generally globally. I wanted to start with really, I don't think Trump as a phenomenon can be understood purely by fixating on the figure of Trump himself, in that I think far more significant is the negative side of this election, which is the collapse of the centre ground and the collapse and Hillary Clinton's loss. One of the things about, Sumaya mentioned how Trump put on these kind of anti-establishment credentials. And, you know, part of that is obvious bullshit. He's the son of a billionaire. Actually, his business record is terrible. Yes. So how much money he had to start with. And he clearly isn't, you know, anti-establishment in any serious sense of the term. He is, of course, an outsider from the political establishment, and he ran his campaign on an absolute shoestring. All the major money from you know, the big guns of American capital came behind Hillary Clinton. So this was really a major failure for the American ruling class in many ways. They put a lot into backing Clinton as a candidate, and Clinton's candidature and the campaign she ran was very much aimed at wooing the American ruling class. So she got a string of like senior Republicans, former presidents, etc., to basically back her and disavow Trump, for instance. And also going along in parallel with the way that the money, the campaign finance, and senior political figures in America were corralled in behind Clinton, you saw the kind of the pundit class, the liberal commentariat, who were all basically singing Hillary Clinton's praises, writing kind of, you know, data articles on Vox.com about how the figures prove it's impossible, statistically impossible for Trump to win, you know, slicing up the statistics. And I remember reading this a couple of weeks before the election, and you know, for my sins, having some facility with numbers and data these days, kind of looking a bit more closely into the figures. And it was actually Nate Silver on 538.com was one of the few people in this kind of new breed of American data commentator to actually say these figures are not looking good for Hillary Clinton. The models are suggesting maybe she has a 3 in 4 or a 4 in 5 chance of winning. There is a significant chance that there could be a systematic error in the models and Trump could win. He was one of the very few people saying that. So the failure of the American ruling class to kind of win its campaign, I think also goes hand in hand with the failure of political commentary and commentariat in America. And I think those are two sides of the same coin. They're very much the same phenomenon, and I think it's important to bear that in mind, because the very same people who were completely dismissive of Trump's chances before the election and were completely adulatory and uncritical towards Hillary Clinton's campaign are now, coming out with all sorts of advice about what to do. And I think we need to be a little bit careful about taking what they say at face value. In terms of what actually happened, Sumaya stressed the issue, and I think this is important, about the turnout on the Democratic side. There was an extent to which Trump's combination of racism and populism managed to raise the vote, pull in new voters in certain specific areas, the so-called Rust Belt. You did see a large number of people coming out and voting Republican. But by and large, the people who voted Republican at the last election are the people who vote Republican generally. Or the people who voted Republican in 2012, people who voted Republican in 2008. We have not seen a significant rise in the Republican vote or a big shift into the kind of camp of sort of disgusting misogyny and reaction that Trump's campaign certainly represented. What was interesting is that despite the efforts of much of the Republican mainstream to shut Trump out or to disavow him as a candidate, your average Republican voter came out and voted for him. What's much more significant, I think, is that people who came out and voted for Obama enthusiastically in 2008, and for the most part, with a lot less enthusiasm, still came out and voted for him in 2012, did not come out and vote for Hillary Clinton. And I think that to me is quite a crucial issue. Part of what I think is going on here is the fact that Clinton's campaign was almost wholly negative. I mean, a lot of people said that you went to a Trump rally, you knew what his policies were, what his claims were. They were crazy, build a wall, they were racist, but he was actually saying he was going to do something. Whereas Clinton's campaign was almost wholly based as a negative one against Trump. And this kind of reminded me of a commentary that came out a few years ago by the French leftist philosopher Alain Badiou, who was writing about Sarkozy's victory in France. He wrote a book which is being translated into English as The Meaning of Sarkozy, where he characterised that election as a choice between fear and fear of fear. That you had Sarkozy, who was whipping up hatred against minorities, against Muslims, against the scum on the estates, as he put it. And so there was the politics of fear being pushed by the hard right, and all the so-called centre or left had to say in response was fear of the fear. So vote for the slightly less right-wing person because the right-wing person's really terrible. And the problem is that's actually a very, very weak, it sets off a great moral firestorm in the media, on the TV. Everyone says, oh, isn't Trump terrible? But as an actual means of getting people to vote for something, it doesn't really work. And I think we saw that in terms of the elections results. I also think we saw it in the fact that if you cast your minds back about six months ago, in the run-up, when there was a primaries were still going on with the Democrats, poll after poll after poll showed that Sanders versus Trump, as a candidate, Sanders would have knocked Trump. It would have been game over for Trump if Sanders won. Now, of course, there are very, very serious reasons why Sanders wasn't the candidate, and that's due to the nature of the Democratic Party itself. But I'm sure Sumaya could probably talk about that in more detail than I am. But the point remains that if the Democrats had run someone who had something positive and actually had something to say to appeal to people, I don't think Trump would be heading towards the White House as he is at the moment. In terms of Trump himself, as I said, his campaign, racism and populism, it had some effect in terms of pulling over voters who previously voted Democrat, but I think that's a secondary element, and the primary one is Democrats not voting. Democrats, whether it's voter suppression, whether it's just not being enthused by the candidate, whether it was just discussed at what Hillary Clinton stands for, what the Democratic leadership did to Sanders, what the Democratic leadership has done over the past 24 years while it's been in power. And I think there is a lot of questions now about what is going to happen when he gets into power. I'm not going to make any serious predictions on this. I think there is going to be a big tussle at the top of the Republican Party over one attempt to try to kind of normalise Trump by bringing in other more safe pair of hand Republican elements into his administration. His vice president, I think, is part of that. So there will be an effort by the Republicans to turn Trump into a normal right-wing Republican presidency, which is, of course, not a good thing for anyone. You know, the racism, the homophobia, all of that kind of cultural reaction will be there, but they will try to do that. Trump himself, I think, is a bit more of a wild card, seeing as he wrested the nomination from that establishment in the first place. There has been a lot of talk about the alt-right and the openly Nazi elements of people who supported Trump. I do think that these people will be energised by Trump and have been energised, and the attacks show that. I will word of caution though. I mean, the Ku Klux Klan has like a membership base in the thousands, and if you go back 100 years, it was 1,000 times as large. So we are talking about quite small organisations. I mean, David Duke got 3% of the vote in Louisiana, which is one of the most racist places in the world. So the alt-right are, they're obviously a media phenomenon, an internet phenomenon, but like many of these internet media phenomena, I think they're quite kind of transitory. I think there's a bubble of hype around them, and I think actually they've been lifted far more by that bubble of hype than by anything they've actually done. My guess, and I would say this is a guess, is that Trump's administration will turn out to be a normal, vicious, right-wing Republican administration. And I think a lot of the attempts to characterise what's going on as incipient fascism are really coming from the sections of the liberal commentariat that bet their houses and put all their eggs into the Clinton basket and are now in shock, panic and denial as they try to, as things try to unwind. I want to just end on where I think things are going to go, what the left can do, both in America and more generally, because I do think there's a much wider pattern here. This picture of a collapse of a sort of neoliberal centrist consensus is one you're seeing across the globe at the moment. Just an interesting thing this year has been the first time for many, many years that trade growth has actually halted in terms of its, there a period of kind of expansionary neoliberalism that's dominated the global political economy for the past 20 years or so has ground to a halt, and the political projects that were built on that foundation are also hitting a crisis. So you're seeing the European Union and Britain in complete deadlock. We've obviously had the Brexit vote in Britain, which has caused all manner of paralysis at the top of British society. Look out for December the 4th, when there's going to be a referendum in Italy on constitutional changes there. And I think that the collapse of the Clinton project is part and parcel of that. And there are two ways, really, that the left can respond. And I think at the moment, you're seeing both happening. And I would argue that one of them is a recipe for disaster, and one of them is where we should go. The two things are, one of the reactions is to shore up this disintegrating centre ground. And I think that is happening at the moment. There is a concerted effort, I think, in much of the American liberal circles to somehow blame the radical left for Trump's victory. So, it was the people voting Jill Stein, it was the people who who cared too much about the working class and weren't really focused on, were too critical of Hillary Clinton. You know, these arguments disappear the moment you actually look at the numbers, but that's not really the point of it. The point is, and we saw a version of this in 2000 when Bush won in a very close election against Gore. There was a massive backlash against Ralph Nader, and I think a period of months and months where the sections of the left went on a wild goose chase of trying to reverse the election results. Whereas I think that's a mistake. I think what's much more important are the protests you're seeing on the ground at the moment, because the alternative to try to shore up the centre ground is to build an alternative from the left, and that's the point I really want to end on. At the moment, you've got the centre ground collapsing and a resurgent populist right that is coming up and reaping the benefits. And what happens is you start getting a ratcheting motion, that everything starts shifting further and further and further to the right. Now, if the radical left runs after into the abyss that the centre liberals are falling into, we will never ever build an alternative that can pull things back the other way. And you look at what happened in Italy in the 2000s when the radical left ended up shoring up the social democratic left and is now nowhere. Or even more scarily, you look at what has happened in Eastern Europe, where the social democratic left allied with the neoliberals and thus completely lost its credibility. And in certain Eastern European countries, you really are seeing fascism coming up. That, to me, is a big danger. The left has to start building its own alternative from below, and that involves, I think, a break with the centre ground and centrist politics that have actually created the disaster we see at the moment. Thanks,
Can you hear you?
I can hear you.
Okay. So, I mean, two of the questions that kind of to group together were, which I know you addressed in your talk kind of briefly, were why working class women did vote for Trump, so in majority, why the black community generally didn't back Sanders in the Democratic primaries. But kind of three questions that I suppose kind of fit a conclusion a little bit more directly, where what indications are that Trump actually will try to roll out some significant change to American policy? Particularly foreign policy was mentioned, but some of the stuff around climate change kind of came up quite a bit as well as some of the more kind of things around racism and social policy. Some comments about some of the people that he's brought into his government, his regime, being quite further to the right than you'd expect from the Republican mainstream. Is probably the charitable way to put it. And particularly one comment, which is what are the prospects, some discussion about whether or not Trump was fascist leaning towards the not. So generally people saying Trump wasn't a fascist, but what are the prospects of him shifting the agenda to the right? And potentially kind of movements on the ground, radical movements, forming to kind of back up some of his wilder policy demands that kind of shift things further. Did that make sense as a set of questions? I realise that's a lot to throw at someone just after they've come on to
could you repeat the last one?
So what are the prospects of a radical movement of the right emerging around kind of Trump's politics? I suppose a bit like the Tea Party did a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want me to bring that in while you think about that, or?
Yeah, just give me a minute.
Yeah. No, do you mind giving me a few Sumaya catch their thoughts?
What to sort of respond to? Okay, I've written down a few kind of fairly random things here. In terms of parallels with France and Britain and internationally more generally, I think that there are quite important distinctions. Modi in India, I think you could seriously describe as a fascist. I mean, he came up, his political base came from below. It's got the RSS at the core of it. He worked his way up the apparatus. Now that he's in the top, he's mobilising these groups from below. And that is very much the kind of total counter-revolution model from below of fascism. So of all the various different things that people say are fascist these days, I'd say Modi is actually the closest you can get to that. Marine Le Pen, I think, is... I think currently it looks as though Fillon is going to get the mainstream right wing, who's a hard right hatchet man. the polls are suggesting that if it was Fillon versus Le Pen, it would be 2/3 Fillon, 1/3 Le Pen, because the socialist vote would flock to Fillon. If Marine Le Pen gets in, I think, well, obviously the Front National is a fascist party that dressed itself up in more respectable clothing. There is a question as to what extent the break between Marine Le Pen and her father, her uncle. Is it uncle? Father. Sorry, it's his niece who's like on his side. I keep getting this confused. But, to what extent that is actually cosmetic, and to what extent it represents a real policy difference. I'll cast people's minds back to the example of Gianfranco Fini about 10, 15 years ago, who came out of a classical fascist party but got absorbed into the mainstream right. So I think that's a possibility in France, but my guess at the moment will be that you will see a kind of replay of what happened in 2002, except everything shifted a bit more to the right. Which kind of the issue about the crisis of socialism, social democracy leading to a crisis of liberalism. This is a scary prospect, and this is kind of what I'm getting at with this ratcheting over to the right. I mean, Christian mentioned like the reforms that New Labour did bring in. They all got abolished like within years of getting in a Tory government. Obamacare can go just like that. When the right come in, they make structural changes that the left is either too timid or doesn't think is possible to reverse. And when the right comes in, it just undoes what the left does, which is why I think we need a much more radical alternative. Because actually, what's happening is that the material basis of power on the left of society has been depleted, and so that's why, when things kind of echo in the political superstructure, we find that the left is punching less and less and less and less. And building that movement from below, I think, is the absolute priority. I think the building blocks for it in the States are certainly there. You saw people mentioned Occupy and so on. But I don't think when we see this collapse of liberalism, joining in the wailing and mourning is the very last thing we should be doing.
Okay, sorry, Sumaya. I'm taking you back off mute. Are you ready?
Yeah, I can start to tackle some of the questions. So one of the questions is about why Black voters were not attracted to Bernie, at least not as much as he thought that they would be. That's something that's been debated a lot, and I think one of the reasons has to do with Hillary Clinton's the way she presented herself to the media and who she had behind her at that time, especially early on last year. It's important to remember that the mothers of the movement, which are a group of Black women whose sons were killed by police violence, like the mother of Trayvon Martin is one example. Or not all, most of them were backing Clinton and spoke in support of her. In addition to that, Clinton kept bringing up the fact that she worked in the Children's Defense Fund right after college, and this was like an NGO set in the Deep South that exposed racial discrimination in schools and in jails during the Civil Rights era and later on. And so she also used that in order to appeal to Black voters. So I think those are two of the things that are mentioned most when people are trying to analyze why it is that more Black people did not vote for Sanders. Another question was about Trump and his foreign policy and climate change. So Trump has not said too much about his foreign policy. One of the things he keeps emphasizing, he emphasized during the debates and has been speaking about now, is Russia and his relationship with Russia. What will likely happen is he's going to join forces with Russia and focus on battling ISIS. And this means a lot in the Middle East. Basically, this means that they will join forces with Assad and Russia, potentially Iran, in order to fight ISIS, and completely quelling any sort of resistance on the ground, any sort of progress that has been made by secular forces in Syria that will be completely squashed if this does go through. he's likely to continue the relationship with Israel. In fact, probably going to have a tighter relationship with Israel now, which is hard to imagine given the Obama administration just gave Israel $38 billion in aid. But that relationship is likely to tighten. One of the first people to respond to Trump's victory was Netanyahu from Israel, and he tweeted congratulations to Trump. And in fact, the only two foreign government leaders that Trump called or spoke to in the week after his election were Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel and Abdel Fattah al-Sisi of Egypt. So this tells you a lot about his foreign policy and who he's going to side with and who he's going to work with. So repression of boycott, divestment, sanctions on college campuses and in labor in the United States is going to increase. He's likely going to be a lot more lenient on settlement building in Israel. In fact, Israel just released that it's going to be building 500 new homes and settlements across the West Bank. And this is something no one's talking about. So in terms of foreign policy, I think that gives you an idea of what we're going to be dealing with. As far as his team, the people he's hiring, the best example of this is Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon is a right-wing media figure. He's the head of Breitbart News, which is a right-wing news source that publishes anti-abortion, very sexist, Islamophobic, homophobic content. And this man is openly Islamophobic, anti-Semitic. And he's going to be the chief strategist under Trump. He's been appointed as chief strategist. And in response to that, there have actually been really big protests across the country. In New York City, 2 weeks ago, Bannon was invited to speak at the Zionist Organization of America for a gala in New York City. And there was a protest of several thousand people, and they actually shut down the event, and he wasn't able to speak at the end. So there's clearly been a pushback against this. I think those were some of the main questions. Oh, the Dakota Access Pipeline. I think someone mentioned that. So Trump has not released any sort of statement specifically about the pipeline in North Dakota. He hasn't really needed to because Obama and the Democratic Party have been doing all the necessary things to repress the protesters and to allow the pipeline to be built. Right now there are over 15,000 people at the encampments, even though it's sub-zero temperatures over there. And they've been attacked using rubber bullets, grenades, concussion grenades, water hoses. And there's recently been an eviction notice that's been sent out that the camp will be closed by December 5th. And that authorities are going to go in and close it. And Obama has yet to release any sort of statement about this. There are protests weekly against Dakota Access Pipeline. Obviously, Hillary Clinton, Obama, all these ruling class figures benefit from this pipeline. Donald Trump has $500,000 invested in this particular pipeline, so we're not expecting to see him say anything about that. He also, doesn't believe in climate change. So all of these things are likely to increase under a Trump presidency, but it's important to remember, and someone mentioned this in the audience, that a lot of what Trump is inheriting, Obama has already started, right? And he's just going to continue that. And so it's just a matter of how much worse will it be under Trump. And the fact that we're seeing all these protests and all this opposition already, and he hasn't even taken office, I think is very positive. And we need to make sure that that's consistent and that continues to happen, and that people don't lose momentum over January and February.
Cool. Thank you very much, Sumaya. Cool, guys. Well, thank you for everyone for coming. We organise Central London meetings kind of on a monthly basis, kind of around the SARS area, which we aim to kind of address kind of different topics at. If you're interested in kind of coming along, you don't have contacts. Kate is kind of working with us at the moment to kind of keep them in the loop about what's going on.